In a world where power speaks louder than justice, where military ranks can move mountains and silence storms, one moment of violence against an innocent young woman would trigger a chain reaction that no one saw coming. What happens when the daughter of a legendary admiral becomes the victim of a brutal attack? What happens when three of the nation's most powerful generals discover that the broken girl lying in a hospital bed carries blood that commands their absolute loyalty and respect? This is not just a story about revenge. This is not just a tale of military might flexing its muscles. This is the true account of how one horrific incident exposed a web of corruption, transformed a quiet town into a battlefield of justice, and proved that sometimes the most unexpected heroes emerge from the deepest shadows of tragedy. Sarah Chun never knew her father's true influence until the day she nearly died. What followed would shake the very foundations of power, challenge the corrupt systems that ruled with iron fists, and show the world that some bonds of loyalty run deeper than blood, deeper than rank, and deeper than fear itself. Prepare yourself for a journey that will take you from the sterile halls of a military hospital to the marble corridors of power, from the quiet streets of a small town to the highest echelons of military command. This is the story of how 3 phone calls changed everything, how loyalty was tested, how justice was served, and how a father's love manifested through the unwavering dedication of those who served under him. The clock started ticking the moment Sarah's body hit the pavement. What happened next would prove that some people should never be touched, some families should never be threatened, and some fathers should never be underestimated, even from beyond the grave. Sarah Chun had always preferred the quiet corners of life. At 24, she worked as a librarian in the small coastal town of Millbrook, a place where everyone knew everyone, where the most exciting event was usually the annual seafood festival, and where trouble rarely knocked on anyone's door. She lived in a modest apartment above the old bookstore on Main Street, drove a reliable but unremarkable sedan, and spent her evenings reading novels that transported her to far-off places she never expected to visit. The only remarkable thing about Sarah was something she rarely mentioned, and most people never suspected. Her father had been Admiral James Chun, a decorated naval officer who had served his country with distinction for over 30 years before his death in a training accident when Sarah was just 16. She kept his military portrait tucked away in a drawer, along with the flag that had covered his coffin and the letters of condolence from colleagues whose names would have surprised anyone who read them. Sarah had chosen anonymity deliberately. After her father's funeral, attended by more high-ranking military officials than she could count, she had decided she wanted nothing to do with that world of uniforms, salutes, and rigid hierarchies. She changed her name from Chun Morrison back to just Chun, moved far from the naval base where she had grown up, and created a life that was entirely her own. On the evening of March 15th, Sarah was walking home from the library after staying late to help with inventory. The streets of Millbrook were dimly lit, but she had walked this route hundreds of times and felt perfectly safe. The town had one of the lowest crime rates in the state, and the most dangerous thing that usually happened was teenagers spray painting graffiti on the pier. She was thinking about the new mystery novel she planned to start reading when she heard footsteps behind her. This wasn't unusual. People often walked the same route from downtown to the residential areas. But something about the rhythm of these steps made her glance over her shoulder. 3 men were following about 20 feet behind her, and when she looked back, they didn't look away or change direction as most people would. Sarah's heartbeat quickened, but she told herself she was being paranoid. Still, she turned left onto Elm Street instead of continuing straight to her apartment. It would add 5 minutes to her walk, but it would take her past the police station. If the men were just coincidentally walking in the same direction, they would continue straight. They turned left too. Now Sarah's mouth went dry. She reached for her phone, but before she could dial anything, she heard the footsteps quickening behind her. She started to run, but she was wearing flats that weren't meant for sprinting, and the men behind her were clearly in much better shape. They caught up with her just past the alley behind Morrison's hardware store. The largest of the 3 grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. In the weak streetlight, she could see he was wearing expensive clothes, not the kind of outfit she would have expected from a street criminal. "Sarah Chun," he said, and his use of her name sent ice water through her veins. "This wasn't a random mugging. I think you have me confused with someone else," she managed to say, trying to keep her voice steady. The man laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, we know exactly who you are. Daughter of the great Admiral James Chun. The Admiral who cost our family everything." Sarah's mind raced. She had no idea what this man was talking about. Her father had been dead for 8 years, and she had deliberately distanced herself from his military career. She couldn't imagine how his service could have affected anyone in a small town like Millbrook. "My father died years ago," she said. "Whatever you think he did, what I think." The man's voice rose. "I know exactly what he did. My uncle was Captain Robert Morrison. Does that name ring a bell?" It didn't, but Sarah wasn't about to admit that. She was frantically trying to remember if she had ever heard her father mention anyone named Morrison, but her knowledge of his professional life was limited to the basic facts and the few stories he had shared over family dinners. "Captain Morrison was discharged dishonorably because of your father's testimony," the man continued. "Court-martialed for corruption, stripped of his pension, humiliated in front of everyone he had ever served with. He died broke and bitter, and it's all because of Admiral James Chun." "I'm sorry for your loss," Sarah said carefully, "but that has nothing to do with me. I was just a kid when my father died. I don't know anything about his cases or his testimony." "It has everything to do with you," said one of the other men, speaking for the first time. "You're his blood. You carry his name. You're going to pay the debt your family owes ours." Sarah realized with growing terror that these men weren't interested in money or apologies or explanations. They wanted revenge, and they had decided she was an acceptable target for settling a score with a dead man. She tried to run again, but the alley was narrow, and they were positioned to block both ends. When she attempted to dart past the smallest of the 3 men, he grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. Pain shot through her shoulder, and she cried out. "Please," she gasped. "This is insane. You can't hold me responsible for something that happened when I was a teenager, something I don't even know anything about." "We could do whatever we want," the leader said. "Just like your father did whatever he wanted. Just like he destroyed our family because he could." The next few minutes were a blur of violence that Sarah's mind would later refuse to process clearly. She remembered being shoved against the brick wall of the hardware store, the rough surface scraping against her face. She remembered trying to protect her head with her hands and feeling her wrist crack under the force of a kick. She remembered the taste of blood in her mouth and the sound of her own voice screaming for help in a town where most people were already asleep. But what she remembered most clearly was the moment when the largest man picked up a piece of broken concrete from the alley floor. She saw him raise it above his head, saw the intent in his eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that these men intended to kill her. "Wait," she whispered, though she didn't know what she was asking them to wait for. "Your father never waited," the man said. "He never showed mercy to Captain Morrison. Why should we show mercy to you?" The concrete came down with sickening force, and Sarah's world went black. She didn't know how long she lay unconscious in that alley. When she finally came to, it was because of the pain, a throbbing, overwhelming agony that seemed to emanate from every part of her body. She tried to open her eyes, but only one of them would respond, and even that sent spikes of pain through her skull. Through her working eye, she could see that it was still dark, but she could hear something that hadn't been there before. Sirens. Someone had found her, or someone had finally heard the commotion and called for help. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Her left arm was definitely broken, possibly in more than one place. Her ribs screamed in protest when she attempted to breathe deeply. Her face felt swollen and wrong, and when she touched it with her functioning hand, her fingers came away sticky with blood. But she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was alive. The paramedics found her a few minutes later, alerted by Mrs. Henderson from the apartment above the hardware store, who had finally been awakened by the sounds of the attack. By the time the ambulance arrived, Sarah was drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling incoherently about admirals and captains and men who wanted to collect debts from the dead. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, one of the paramedics was talking to the police officer who had arrived first on the scene. "Looks like a robbery gone bad," the officer was saying. "Her purse is missing, and they really worked her over." Sarah wanted to correct him, wanted to explain that this hadn't been about money, that somehow her father's military service had reached across 8 years and nearly gotten her killed in a small town where she had thought she was safe and anonymous. But her jaw wasn't working properly, and the pain medication the paramedics had given her was making it hard to form coherent thoughts. As the ambulance raced toward Regional Medical Center 40 minutes away, Sarah slipped back into unconsciousness. She had no way of knowing that the attack on her had been witnessed by more than just Mrs. Henderson's sleepy eyes. The alley behind Morrison's hardware store was equipped with a security camera that the police would discover the next morning, a camera that had captured not only the faces of her attackers, but also the license plate of the car they had used to escape. More importantly, Sarah had no way of knowing that among her father's effects, which she had stored in a safety deposit box without ever thoroughly examining, was a small address book containing emergency contact information. Information that included the personal phone numbers of 3 men who had served under Admiral James Chun. 3 men who had risen through the ranks in the years since his death. 3 men who had never forgotten their former commanding officer or the promise they had made to him about looking after his daughter if anything ever happened to him. The wheels of justice were about to start turning, but they would be driven by forces that Sarah Chun had never imagined and powered by loyalties that went deeper than she had ever known. In the emergency room at Regional Medical Center, as doctors worked to stabilize her condition and catalog her injuries, Sarah's personal effects were placed in a plastic bag according to standard procedure. Among those effects was her driver's license, which listed her full legal name, Sarah Elizabeth Chun. A diligent hospital administrator, following protocol for cases involving assault, ran her name through the system to check for emergency contacts and insurance information. What he found in the database was a notation that had been placed there years earlier by her father's attorney, a notation that most people would have overlooked, but that this particular administrator recognized for what it was. Sarah Chun was flagged as the daughter of a deceased military officer, with specific instructions that in case of emergency, certain individuals were to be contacted immediately. The administrator looked at the list of phone numbers attached to the flag, noted the area codes and prefixes that suggested these were military or government contacts, and decided that a brutal assault probably qualified as the kind of emergency the notation was meant to address. He had no idea that the 3 phone calls he was about to make would change everything, not just for Sarah, but for everyone involved in the attack against her, everyone who had failed to protect her, and everyone who would be called upon to deliver justice in her name. As Sarah lay unconscious in the trauma bay, with machines monitoring her vital signs and doctors working to repair the damage that had been done to her, the first call was already being placed. By morning, 3 of the most powerful men in the American military would know that Admiral James Chun's daughter had been nearly beaten to death by men seeking revenge for something that had happened almost a decade earlier. And by morning, the hunt for those men would begin. The first thing Sarah became aware of was the steady beeping of machines. The sound pulled her slowly from the dark depths of unconsciousness, each beep marking another moment of existence, another second of survival. Her mind felt foggy and disconnected, as if she were trying to think through thick cotton, but gradually she began to piece together fragments of awareness. She was lying down. The surface beneath her was softer than the concrete where she had fallen. There were voices nearby, quiet and professional, discussing medications and vital signs. Hospital, her mind finally supplied. She was in a hospital. When she tried to open her eyes, only the right one responded, and even that small movement sent waves of pain cascading through her skull. Through her limited vision, she could see white ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights that seemed impossibly bright. She attempted to move her left hand, and discovered it was encased in a cast that extended from her fingers to somewhere near her elbow. "She's awake," someone said, and suddenly there was a face hovering over her, a middle-aged woman in scrubs with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Sarah, my name is Dr. Martinez," the woman said gently. "You're in Regional Medical Center. You were brought in last night after an assault. Do you remember what happened?" The memories came flooding back with brutal clarity. The three men following her, the alley, the accusations about her father and someone named Captain Morrison, the piece of concrete raised above her head. Sarah tried to speak, but found her throat raw and her jaw stiff with pain. "Take your time," Dr. Martinez said. "You have some significant injuries, but you're going to be okay. You have a concussion, 3 broken ribs, a fractured left arm, and substantial bruising, but nothing that won't heal." Sarah managed to croak out a single word. "Why?" Dr. Martinez's expression grew puzzled. "Why what, honey? Why did this happen to you?" "That's something the police are investigating. They'll want to speak with you when you're feeling up to it." But Sarah wasn't asking why the attack had happened. She was asking why she was still alive. She remembered the look in that man's eyes when he raised the concrete. She remembered the absolute certainty that she was about to die. How had she survived? Over the next few hours, as the pain medication made thinking clearer and speaking easier, Sarah learned more about her condition and her rescue. Mrs. Henderson had heard the commotion and called 911, but by the time police and paramedics arrived, her attackers were long gone. The security camera behind the hardware store had captured most of the assault, providing police with clear images of 3 men and the license plate of their vehicle. What Dr. Martinez didn't tell her, because she didn't know, was that Sarah's case had already attracted attention from far beyond the Millbrook Police Department. The notation in the hospital database had triggered a series of phone calls that were now reverberating through the highest levels of military command. The first call had been answered by General Patricia Williams at 3:17 a.m. General Williams was currently the highest-ranking female officer in the Army, a woman who had broken through barriers and shattered glass ceilings throughout her 30-year career. She had served as a young lieutenant under Admiral James Chun during a joint operation in the Mediterranean, and she had never forgotten the lessons he had taught her about leadership, integrity, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. When the hospital administrator explained that Admiral Chin's daughter had been severely beaten in what appeared to be a targeted attack, General Williams felt as if someone had reached in her chest and squeezed her heart. She had met Sarah exactly once, at Admiral Chin's funeral, where the quiet 16-year-old had stood with remarkable composure as they lowered her father into the ground. "I'll be there in 6 hours," General Williams had told the administrator, before immediately beginning to make arrangements for emergency leave and transportation. The second call had reached General Robert Harrison at 3:22 a.m. General Harrison was the current commander of the Marine Corps base at Quantico and had served under Admiral Chun as a young captain during a classified operation that had earned both men commendations they could never publicly discuss. Admiral Chun had not only been Harrison's commanding officer, but had also been his mentor and, in many ways, the closest thing to a father figure he had ever known. When Harrison learned what had happened to Sarah, his response was immediate and volcanic. He had never married, had no children of his own, but he had always considered Admiral Chin's daughter to be under his protection by extension of his loyalty to her father. The fact that someone had dared to harm her, apparently because of her connection to Admiral Chun, was not just a crime. It was a personal affront that demanded immediate and overwhelming response. The third call had awakened General Michael Torres at 3:25 a.m. Torres was the youngest of the three, currently serving as a Pentagon liaison for special operations, but he had served under Admiral Chun longer than the others. He had been a Green Ensign when Admiral Chun had taken him under his wing, had been mentored and guided by the Admiral through 15 years of service before Chin's untimely death. Torres had been one of the pallbearers at Admiral Chin's funeral, and he had made a silent promise to the memory of his commanding officer that he would always be available if Sarah ever needed anything. None of the three generals knew that the others had been contacted. Each had received a call, Each had responded with immediate concern and anger, and each was now making arrangements to travel to Regional Medical Center as quickly as possible. They were converging on Sarah's location from 3 different directions, driven by loyalty, duty, and a shared debt to a man who had shaped their lives and careers. By 8 a.m., Dr. Martinez was dealing with a situation she had never encountered in 20 years of emergency medicine. 3 different military transport vehicles had arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes of each other, each carrying a general who was demanding immediate access to Sarah Chun and immediate briefings on her condition. "I'm sorry, but I can only release medical information to immediate family members," Dr. Martinez explained to the first general to arrive, General Williams, who had flown in on a military transport from Fort Bragg. "Sarah Chun is under military protection," General Williams said calmly, producing identification that made Dr. Martinez's eyes widen. Her father was Admiral James Chun, and there are security protocols in place regarding his family members. "I need to see her immediately." Before Dr. Martinez could respond, General Harrison arrived with 2 aides and a demeanor that could have frozen fire. "Where is she?" he demanded. "Where is Admiral Chen's daughter?" "Sir, I was just explaining to this other general," Dr. Martinez began, only to be interrupted by the arrival of General Torres, who strode through the emergency room doors with a kind of purposeful intensity that made nurses and orderlies automatically step out of his way. The 3 generals stopped short when they saw each other. For a moment, the emergency room fell silent as 3 of the most powerful men in the American military stared at each other in surprise. "Patricia," General Harrison said finally, "I should have known you'd be here." "Bob, Mike," General Williams nodded to each of them. "I suppose we all got the same call." "Admiral Chen's emergency protocols," General Torres said, understanding immediately. He set up multiple contacts in case something happened to Sarah. Dr. Martinez watched this exchange with growing confusion and concern. "Excuse me, but are you all here for the same patient? Because I really need to understand what's going on before I can—" "Doctor," General Williams interrupted gently, "what you need to understand is that Sarah Chun is not just any assault victim. Her father was one of the most respected officers in military history, and an attack on his daughter is an attack on all of us. We need to see her. We need to understand exactly what happened, and we need to ensure that whoever did this is brought to justice." "More than brought to justice," General Harrison added grimly. "This was a targeted attack. Someone specifically sought out Admiral Chen's daughter to hurt her because of who her father was. That makes this a matter of national security." Dr. Martinez was beginning to understand that she was in the middle of something much larger than a simple assault case. "She's stable, but she's been through severe trauma. She needs rest, and she needs protection," General Torres said. "If this was targeted, they might try again. We need security on this hospital immediately." Within minutes, the atmosphere at Regional Medical Center had completely transformed. Military personnel were taking positions throughout the building. Hospital administrators were being briefed on new security protocols. The Millbrook Police Department was being contacted and informed that federal authorities would be taking over the investigation. And Sarah, lying in her hospital bed with broken bones and a concussion, was about to discover that her carefully constructed life of anonymity had just come to an abrupt end. When Dr. Martinez finally escorted the 3 generals to Sarah's room, she was awake and struggling to eat breakfast with her uninjured hand. She looked up as they entered, and her expression went from confusion to recognition to something approaching panic. She remembered General Williams from her father's funeral, the tall, elegant woman who had spoken briefly with her mother about how much Admiral Chun had meant to his junior officers. She didn't recognize the other 2 men, but their uniforms and bearing made it clear they were high-ranking military officials. "Sarah," General Williams said softly, approaching the bed with the careful movements of someone trying not to startle an injured animal. "I'm Patricia Williams. We met briefly at your father's funeral. These are Generals Harrison and Torres. We served under your father, and we're here because we heard what happened to you." Sarah's throat felt dry. "I don't understand. How did you even know I was here? Your father set up emergency protocols, General Torres explained. He wanted to make sure that if anything ever happened to you, certain people would be notified immediately. But why? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. I'm not in the military. I haven't had anything to do with my father's career since he died. I'm just a librarian. General Harrison stepped forward, and Sarah could see something fierce and protective in his eyes. You're Admiral James, Chen's daughter. That makes you family to everyone who served under him. And what happened to you last night wasn't random. Someone targeted you specifically because of who your father was. Sarah felt cold dread settling in her stomach. What do you mean? The men who attacked you mentioned your father by name, General Williams said gently. They talked about someone named Captain Morrison. They said they were making you pay for something your father did. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. Captain Morrison. One of them said his uncle was Captain Robert Morrison, and that my father's testimony got him court-martialed. The three generals exchanged glances, and Sarah could see recognition in their faces. We know about Captain Morrison, General Torres said quietly. Your father was the primary witness in his court-martial about 9 years ago. Morrison was selling classified information to foreign contacts and skimming money from military contracts. Your father's testimony put him in federal prison. But that was his job, Sarah said desperately. If this Captain Morrison was a criminal, then my father was doing what he was supposed to do. Why should I be punished for that? You shouldn't be, General Harrison said, and his voice carried a tone that suggested anyone who disagreed would face significant consequences. And you won't be. We're going to find the men who did this, and we're going to make sure they understand exactly what kind of mistake they made when they decided to harm Admiral Chen's daughter. Sarah looked at the three powerful figures surrounding her bed and felt a strange mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She had spent 8 years building a life separate from her father's legacy, and now that legacy had literally followed her into a dark alley and nearly killed her. But it had also brought these three people to her bedside, people who clearly considered protecting her to be a sacred duty. What happens now, she asked. Now, General Williams said, we make some phone calls. We coordinate with local and federal law enforcement. We use every resource at our disposal to track down the people who did this. And then? Sarah asked. General Harrison's smile was not pleasant. Then, they learn what happens when someone hurts family. The conference room at Regional Medical Center had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Within 12 hours of Sarah's admission to the hospital, the small space was packed with more law enforcement authority than the town of Millbrook had seen in its entire history. Detective Ray Kowalski from the Millbrook Police Department sat at one end of the table, looking slightly overwhelmed as he found himself surrounded by federal agents, military investigators, and three generals who clearly outranked everyone else in the room by several levels. He had been a small-town cop for 15 years, and the most serious case he had handled before this was a string of break-ins at summer cottages along the shore. Let me make sure I understand the situation, said Agent Jennifer Martinez from the FBI field office in Boston. She was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who had arrived on a military transport helicopter along with a team of federal investigators. 3 men specifically targeted Miss Chun because of her father's role in court-martialing their relative nearly a decade ago. That's correct, Detective Kowalski confirmed, consulting his notes nervously. We have video evidence from the hardware store security camera. The audio quality isn't great, but we can clearly hear them mention Admiral Chun and Captain Morrison. They specifically said they were making her pay for what her father did to their family. General Harrison leaned forward, his expression grim. What do we know about these men? Have they been identified? We're working on that, Agent Martinez replied. The security footage gives us clear facial recognition data, and we have a partial license plate. My team is running everything through federal databases now. Partial plate? General Torres asked. What about the full number? Detective Kowalski shifted uncomfortably. The camera angle cuts off the last 2 digits. But we have the first 4 characters and the state, Massachusetts plates. That's still thousands of possible vehicles, Agent Martinez said. But combined with facial recognition and the fact that these men clearly have a personal connection to Captain Morrison, we should be able to narrow it down significantly. General Williams had been quietly reviewing a file that had been delivered to her an hour earlier. Now she looked up with an expression that suggested she had found something important. "I have Captain Morrison's complete service record here," she said. "He was court-martialed 8 years ago on charges of selling classified submarine patrol routes to foreign contacts and embezzling funds from defense contracts. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, but died of a heart attack after serving only 4 years. Any family members listed?" Agent Martinez asked. "A sister named Dorothy Morrison Walsh, married to a man named Thomas Walsh. They live in Springfield. She has 3 sons, Michael, David, and Robert Walsh." Detective Kowalski felt a chill run down his spine. "The license plate fragment we have starts with the letters that would be consistent with a Springfield registration. Give me everything on the Walsh family," General Harrison ordered. "Financial records, employment history, criminal background checks, social media activity, everything." Agent Martinez was already making notes. "My team can have that information within 2 hours. But I have to ask, are we sure we want to handle this through federal channels? The local police could know." General Torres's voice cut through the room like a knife. "This is not a local matter anymore. These men didn't just assault a young woman. They targeted her specifically because her father served his country with honor. They attacked her to get revenge against a dead war hero who exposed corruption and treason. This is absolutely a federal matter." Dr. Martinez knocked on the conference room door and entered without waiting for permission. She looked tired and stressed, and her usually professional demeanor was showing cracks. "I need to speak with you about Sarah's condition," she said, addressing the room in general. "She's stable, but she's asking questions that I don't know how to answer." "What kind of questions?" General Williams asked. "She wants to know if she's safe here. She wants to know if these men are going to come back for her. She's heard military vehicles arriving at the hospital, and she's seen armed personnel in the hallways. She's scared, and frankly, so are my staff." General Harrison stood up, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the table. "Dr. Martinez, I want you to assure Miss Chun that she is absolutely safe. We have security teams positioned throughout this facility and the surrounding area. No one is going to get within 100 yards of her without being identified and cleared by our people." "But what about after she leaves the hospital?" Dr. Martinez asked. "She's going to need ongoing medical care, physical therapy, counseling probably. She can't live the rest of her life under military protection." "She can live under protection for as long as necessary," General Torres said firmly. "Admiral Chun saved more lives during his career than most people could count. He served his country with distinction, and he died in service to that country. The least we can do is make sure his daughter is safe from people who want to hurt her because of his service." Agent Martinez looked up from her phone. "I just got preliminary information back on the Walsh family. This is interesting and disturbing." She passed copies of a printed report around the table. "Michael Walsh, age 28, has a history of assault charges that were dropped when victims refused to testify. David Walsh, 26, was dishonorably discharged from the Army 2 years ago for insubordination and threats against superior officers. Robert Walsh, 24, has been arrested twice for domestic violence, but never convicted." "A family of thugs," Detective Kowalski muttered. "It gets worse," Agent Martinez continued. "Their mother, Dorothy Morrison Walsh, has been posting on social media for years about how her brother was murdered by the military justice system. She's been spreading conspiracy theories about Admiral Chun, claiming he was part of some kind of cover-up and that her brother was innocent." General Williams felt her jaw tighten. "What kind of conspiracy theories?" "She claims Admiral Chun was taking bribes to frame innocent officers. She says her brother discovered evidence of corruption in the submarine program and was silenced before he could expose it. She's been posting this stuff on military family support forums, trying to get other people to believe that Admiral Chun was the real criminal." The room fell silent as the implications of this information sank in. So these weren't just angry relatives seeking random revenge, General Torres said slowly. They actually believe that Admiral Chun was corrupt and that their uncle was innocent. They think they're delivering justice, which makes them even more dangerous, Agent Martinez pointed out. People who think they're on a righteous mission are unpredictable and often willing to escalate. Detective Kowalski was studying the photos that had been printed from the security footage. If these are the Walsh brothers, we need to move fast. Men like this don't stop after one attack. They're going to see the military response here and interpret it as proof that they're on to something important. What do you mean? Dr. Martinez asked. Think about it from their perspective, Detective Kowalski explained. They attack a librarian in a small town, expecting maybe a local police investigation and some minor charges. Instead, 3 generals show up with federal agents and military security teams. To conspiracy-minded people, that's going to look like confirmation that Sarah Chun is more important than she appears to be. General Harrison was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling for additional security. If these men are going to escalate, we need to be ready for them. Wait, Agent Martinez said. Before we lock down the entire region, let me see if we can locate them through conventional means. We have their names, we have their faces, we have their vehicle information. Let's try tracking them down before they have a chance to plan their next move. Over the next 6 hours, a manhunt unlike anything the region had ever seen unfolded across 3 states. Federal agents coordinated with state police and local law enforcement agencies to monitor the Walsh family's known associates and previous addresses. Military intelligence resources that were normally reserved for international operations were quietly redirected to help track down 3 domestic criminals. The break came 11:30 p.m. when a state trooper in Connecticut spotted the vehicle from the security footage at a gas station outside Hartford. The car was registered to David Walsh, and security cameras at the station captured all 3 brothers, along with an older woman who matched the description of their mother. They're traveling together, Agent Martinez reported to the assembled team, and they're heading south, possibly back toward Massachusetts. Or toward the hospital, General Williams said grimly. Either way, we're ready for them, General Harrison replied. He had spent the evening coordinating with base commanders throughout the region, and now had enough military personnel positioned around the hospital to repel a small invasion. If they try to get anywhere near Sarah, they're going to find out what happens when you declare war on the United States military. But the Walsh brothers weren't planning another direct assault. They had spent the day monitoring news reports and social media, and they had seen the massive security response to their attack on Sarah. Rather than being intimidated, they had become convinced that they had stumbled onto something much bigger than they had originally thought. Look at this, Dorothy Morrison Walsh said, showing her sons a tablet computer as they drove through the night. Military transports, federal agents, 3 generals, all for one girl? That's not a normal response to a random assault. What do you think it means? Michael asked from the driver's seat. I think it means she knows something, his mother replied. I think Sarah Chun has evidence about what really happened with your Uncle Robert. Maybe she has documents or recordings or something that proves Admiral Chun was corrupt. So what do we do? David asked. Dorothy Morrison Walsh smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. We get that evidence. We make her tell us what she knows. And then we expose the truth about Admiral James Chun to the whole world. What the Walsh family didn't realize was that their car had been equipped with a tracking device during their stop at the gas station, planted by a federal agent posing as a service attendant. Every mile they drove, every turn they made, was being monitored by a joint task force that included the FBI, military intelligence, and local law enforcement. As their car headed south through the Connecticut darkness, 3 generals sat in a hospital conference room, making plans that would ensure the Walsh family's crusade for revenge would end very differently than they expected. Sarah Chun, sedated and sleeping fitfully in her hospital bed, had no idea that her father's legacy was about to be tested once again, or that the loyalty he had inspired in his subordinates would soon be demonstrated in ways that would reshape everything she thought she knew about her quiet, anonymous life. The second phase of the confrontation was about to begin, and this time the advantage would belong entirely to the other side. Sarah woke to the sound of hushed voices and footsteps in the hallway outside her room. The pain medication had helped her sleep for a few hours, but her body's aching reminded her immediately of everything that had happened. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:47 a.m. The hospital should have been quiet at this hour, but instead there seemed to be more activity than during the day. She pressed the call button for the nurse, and within seconds, a young man in scrubs appeared at her door. But behind him, she could see someone in military fatigues standing at attention in the hallway. "Is everything okay?" she asked. "There seems to be a lot of activity for the middle of the night." The nurse, whose name tag read Kevin, looked uncomfortable. "Everything's fine, Miss Chun. Just routine security checks. How are you feeling? Do you need anything for pain?" Before Sarah could answer, General Williams appeared in the doorway. She looked tired but alert, and her expression was serious. "Sarah, I'm sorry to wake you, but we need to talk," she said. "We've located the men who attacked you, and the situation has become more complicated." Sarah felt her heartbeat accelerate. More complicated how? General Williams entered the room and closed the door behind her, though Sarah noticed that the military guard remained visible through the small window. The Walsh brothers, that's their names, aren't acting alone. Their mother has been spreading conspiracy theories about your father for years, and she's convinced them that you have some kind of evidence that could clear her brother's name and prove that your father was corrupt. "That's insane," Sarah said. "I was 16 when my father died. I don't know anything about his cases or his work. I don't have any evidence of anything." "We know that, and anyone who knew your father knows that," General Williams replied. "But the Walsh family has created their own version of reality where your father was the villain and their relative was the victim. They're not going to be convinced by logic or facts." Sarah pulled herself higher in the bed, wincing as the movement sent pain through her ribs. "What does that mean for me?" "It means they're not done. Our intelligence suggests they're planning to try to kidnap you and force you to give them information they think you have. They believe that if they can make you confess that your father was corrupt, they can clear their uncle's name posthumously." The room seemed to tilt around Sarah. "Kidnap me? But I'm in a hospital surrounded by security. They're not going to try to take you from here," General Williams assured her. "We have this facility locked down completely. But eventually you're going to be discharged, and when that happens, they'll be waiting. So what do I do? Live in hiding for the rest of my life?" General Williams was quiet for a moment, and Sarah could see her weighing different options in her mind. "There's another possibility," she said finally. "We could end this tonight." "What do you mean?" "The Walsh brothers think you have evidence that could destroy your father's reputation and clear their uncle's name. What if we let them think they're right? What if we set up a situation where they believe they can get what they want from you?" Sarah felt cold understanding creep over her. "You want to use me as bait. I want to give you a chance to end this on your terms instead of spending the rest of your life looking over your shoulder," General Williams replied. "But only if you're willing. No one is going to force you to do anything." Before Sarah could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. General Harrison entered, followed by General Torres and Agent Martinez. "Any updates?" General Williams asked. "They're about 20 miles from here," Agent Martinez reported. "They stopped at a motel in Riverside, but our surveillance indicates they're planning to move again soon. They've been monitoring police scanner frequencies and social media, trying to get information about the hospital security arrangements." General Torres stepped forward. "Sarah, I know this is overwhelming, but I want you to understand something. Your father was one of the finest officers I ever served under. He was honest, dedicated, and completely incorruptible. Everything he did, including his testimony against Captain Morrison, was in service to his country and his duty. Then, why do these people think he was corrupt?" Sarah asked. "Because sometimes people would rather believe a comfortable lie than accept a painful truth," General Harrison said. "Captain Morrison was guilty of everything he was charged with, and more. The evidence against him was overwhelming. But it's easier for his family to blame your father than to accept that their relative was a traitor who sold out his country for money. Agent Martinez looked up from her phone. We just intercepted a cell phone call between Dorothy Morrison Walsh and someone else. She's been in contact with other military families who believe their relatives were unfairly prosecuted. She's trying to organize some kind of movement to expose what she calls military justice corruption. How many other families? General Williams asked. At least 6 that we've identified so far. All relatives of officers who were court-martialed for various forms of corruption or treason during the time Admiral Chun was active in military justice proceedings. Sarah felt the weight of this information settling on her shoulders. So this isn't just about Captain Morrison. My father's work affected a lot of families. Your father helped ensure that corrupt officers were held accountable for their crimes, General Torres corrected. He protected the integrity of the military and probably saved countless lives by making sure that officers who would sell out their country weren't in positions of authority. But these families don't see it that way, Sarah said. No, they don't. And Dorothy Morrison Walsh has been feeding their anger and resentment for years. What started as an attack on you has turned into something much bigger. Dr. Martinez entered the room without knocking, looking frazzled and concerned. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a problem, she said. I just got a call from hospital security. There are protesters gathering in the parking lot. About 20 people with signs saying things like justice for Captain Morrison and Admiral Chun was a war criminal. General Harrison's expression darkened. She's bringing the fight here. It's a distraction, Agent Martinez realized. While we're focused on the protesters, the Walsh brothers are probably planning to hit us from another direction. Or she's hoping to create enough chaos that they can slip through our security, General Torres added. Sarah looked around at the assembled group of military and law enforcement officials and felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. For 8 years, she had tried to distance herself from her father's legacy, to create a life that was entirely separate from his military career. But now, faced with people who wanted to destroy his reputation and hurt her because of who he had been, she found herself feeling something she hadn't experienced since his death. Fierce pride in her father's service and a determination to protect his memory. I'll do it, she said quietly. Sarah, you don't have to, General Williams began. Yes, I do, Sarah interrupted. These people attacked me because they think my father was corrupt. They're out there right now spreading lies about him and trying to convince other families that their relatives were innocent victims. If I don't do something to stop this, it's going to keep growing. What exactly are you proposing? Agent Martinez asked. Sarah took a deep breath, then looked directly at General Williams. You said we could end this tonight. How? We stage a controlled confrontation, General Williams explained. We make it look like you're being transferred to another facility for your safety. We choose the route and the timing, and we let them intercept you at a location where we have complete control of the situation. And then they make their demands. You explain that you don't have any evidence because there is no evidence, and they have to choose between accepting the truth or facing the consequences of kidnapping and assaulting the daughter of a decorated war hero in front of multiple federal agents. Agent Martinez was shaking her head. It's too dangerous. If they're armed, if they panic, if something goes wrong, something's going to go wrong anyway, General Harrison pointed out. Right now, we're reacting to their moves. This gives us a chance to control the situation. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of people who had known and served with her father. She saw determination, loyalty, and a commitment to protecting her that went beyond mere duty. But she also saw something else. They were waiting for her to make the decision. Despite their ranks and their authority, they were treating her as an equal partner in this confrontation. I want to hear my father's side of the story first, she said. I want to know exactly what happened with Captain Morrison and why my father testified against him. General Torres nodded. We can get you the complete court-martial records within an hour. Everything except the classified portions. And I want to understand what makes these people so convinced that my father was wrong. We have copies of everything Dorothy Morrison Walsh has been posting online, Agent Martinez said. You can read her version of events and compare it to the actual facts. Okay, Sarah said. Give me everything. Let me understand exactly what I'm dealing with. And then we'll set up this confrontation. As the meeting broke up and various officials left to make preparations, General Williams remained behind. Sarah, I need you to know that this is incredibly brave, she said. Your father would be proud of you. Would he? Sarah asked. I spent 8 years running away from his legacy. I changed my name, moved across the state, tried to pretend that being Admiral Chen's daughter didn't matter. If I had stayed connected to his world, if I had paid attention to his work, maybe I would have known about these conspiracy theories and could have done something to stop them before they got this far. General Williams sat down in the chair beside Sarah's bed. Your father never wanted his career to define your life. He wanted you to be free to make your own choices and create your own path. The fact that you built an independent life for yourself would have made him incredibly proud. And the fact that you're willing to defend his honor now, when it really matters, proves that you are exactly the kind of person he hoped you would become. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes, the first time she had cried since waking up in the hospital. I miss him, she said softly. So do we, General Williams replied. But tonight we have a chance to make sure that his legacy and his memory are protected. We have a chance to make sure that the truth about his service is preserved. As General Williams left to coordinate the operation that would unfold in the next few hours, Sarah closed her eyes and tried to prepare herself for a confrontation that would determine not just her own safety, but the lasting reputation of a man who had died believing that integrity and duty were worth any sacrifice. The final phase of the conflict was about to begin. The warehouse on Route 6 had been abandoned for 3 years, ever since the textile company that owned it had moved operations overseas. Now, at 2:30 in the morning, it was serving as the stage for a carefully orchestrated confrontation that would determine the fate of multiple families and the legacy of a dead war hero. Sarah sat in the back of an unmarked ambulance, wearing civilian clothes over a bulletproof vest that felt heavy and foreign against her injured ribs. Her left arm was still in a cast, and her face bore the visible bruises from the attack 3 days earlier. But her eyes were clear and determined. She had spent the previous 8 hours reading everything: the complete court-martial records for Captain Morrison, the classified summaries of his crimes that had been declassified for her review, and the extensive social media posts and conspiracy theories that Dorothy Morrison Walsh had been spreading for years. The truth was even worse than the generals had initially described. Captain Morrison hadn't just been selling submarine patrol routes to foreign contacts. He had also been involved in a scheme to sell defective equipment to Navy vessels, equipment that would have put hundreds of sailors at risk. Admiral Chen's testimony had not only exposed Morrison's treason, but had likely prevented a catastrophe that could have resulted in the loss of multiple ships and crews. Are you ready? Agent Martinez asked from the front seat of the ambulance. She was wearing the uniform of a paramedic, and her colleagues were positioned throughout the warehouse complex in various disguises. As ready as I'll ever be, Sarah replied. She looked at General Williams, who was monitoring radio communications from a surveillance van parked half a mile away. Are they in position? The Walsh brothers and their mother are approaching from the east. They're following the route we leaked to them through monitored social media channels. They believe you're being transferred to a federal safe house in Springfield. Sarah nodded. The plan was simple but dangerous. The ambulance would appear to break down at the warehouse, forcing a stop at the most isolated point on the route. The Walsh family would see their opportunity to intercept her and make their demands for the evidence they believed she possessed. Federal agents and military personnel were hidden throughout the area, ready to intervene if the situation became violent. But the goal was not immediate arrest. The goal was to let the Walsh family reveal the full extent of their conspiracy, to document their threats and demands, and to give Sarah an opportunity to confront them with the truth about her father's service and their uncle's crimes. Remember, Agent Martinez said, if at any point you feel unsafe, just say the word lighthouse and we'll move in immediately. Sarah checked the small recording device hidden in her jacket pocket. Everything that was about to happen would be documented, both for legal proceedings and for the historical record. The ambulance pulled off Route 6 and into the warehouse parking lot, its emergency flashers creating an urgent strobe pattern in the darkness. The driver, who was actually a federal agent, got out and raised the hood, creating the appearance of mechanical failure. Within minutes, they could see headlights approaching from the road. The Walsh family had taken the bait. David Walsh's car pulled into the parking lot and stopped about 30 yards from the ambulance. Four doors opened simultaneously, and 3 men and an older woman emerged. Even from a distance, Sarah could recognize the faces of the men who had attacked her in the alley behind Morrison's hardware store. Dorothy Morrison Walsh was a thin woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back severely and an expression of absolute righteous conviction. She marched toward the ambulance with the confident stride of someone who believed completely in the justice of her cause. "Sarah Chin," she called out when she was still 20 feet away. "We need to talk." Agent Martinez, still playing her role as a paramedic, stepped protectively in front of the ambulance. "Ma'am, this is a medical transport. I'm going to have to ask you to step back." "We're not here to hurt anyone," Dorothy Walsh said, though her sons were spreading out in a pattern that suggested they were prepared for trouble. "We just want to talk to Miss Chun about her father." Sarah took a deep breath and opened the ambulance door. "It's okay," she said to Agent Martinez. "I'll talk to them." She climbed down from the ambulance, moving carefully because of her injuries, and faced the woman whose conspiracy theories had nearly gotten her killed. "Mrs. Walsh," she said calmly, "I understand you have some concerns about my father's testimony regarding your brother." Dorothy Walsh's eyes lit up with fanatic intensity. "Your father destroyed my brother's life with lies and false evidence. Robert was an honest officer who discovered corruption in the submarine program, and your father had him silenced to protect the real criminals." "That's not what happened," Sarah replied. "I've read the court-martial records. I've seen the evidence. Your brother was selling classified information to foreign agents and providing defective equipment that could have gotten hundreds of sailors killed." "Lies," Dorothy Walsh snapped. "All lies manufactured by your father and his cronies to cover up their own crimes. But you know the truth, don't you? You have the evidence that proves my brother's innocence." Sarah looked at the 3 Walsh brothers, noting their positions and the tension in their body language. Michael, the largest, was clenching and unclenching his fists. David was scanning the area nervously, as if sensing that something was not quite right about this encounter. Robert, the youngest, was staring at Sarah with an expression of confused anger. "I don't have any evidence," Sarah said clearly. "I was 16 when my father died, and I was never involved in his military career. I don't have documents or recordings or secret files. There is no evidence because there was no cover-up." "Then, why are 3 generals protecting you?" David Walsh demanded. "Why are federal agents involved in investigating a simple assault? Why is the military treating you like some kind of VIP if you're just a librarian?" "Because I'm the daughter of Admiral James Chun," Sarah replied, and for the first time in 8 years, she spoke her father's name with complete pride and no reservations. "Because the people who served under him consider it their duty to protect his family. Because when someone attacks the daughter of a decorated war hero to get revenge for crimes that were rightfully prosecuted, it becomes a matter that goes beyond local law enforcement." Dorothy Walsh stepped closer, her voice rising. "Your father was not a hero. He was a corrupt liar who destroyed honest officers to advance his own career. My brother died in prison because of your father's false testimony." "Your brother died in prison because he was a traitor," Sarah said, her own voice growing stronger. "He sold out his country for money. He put hundreds of lives at risk. My father's testimony didn't destroy an innocent man. It stopped a criminal who was endangering national security." "Prove it," Michael Walsh said, speaking for the first time. "If what you're saying is true, prove it." Sarah reached into her jacket pocket, and immediately all 3 men tensed. Agent Martinez's hand moved toward her concealed weapon, and Sarah could sense the federal agents positioned around the warehouse, preparing for action. But instead of a weapon, Sarah withdrew a manila folder that she had been carrying since leaving the hospital. This is the complete record of your uncle's court-martial, she said, holding it out toward Dorothy Walsh. Everything except the portions that are still classified for national security reasons. Read it. Read the evidence. Read the testimony from multiple witnesses, not just my father. Read the financial records that show money flowing from foreign intelligence services to your brother's personal accounts. Dorothy Walsh snatched the folder and began flipping through it frantically, her eyes scanning pages of legal documents and evidence summaries. This is all fabricated, she said, but her voice was less certain now. Mrs. Walsh, Sarah said gently, I understand why you want to believe your brother was innocent. He was your family, and it's natural to want to think the best of people you love. But refusing to accept the truth doesn't change what happened. She's right, Mom, Robert Walsh said quietly. He had been reading over his mother's shoulder, and his expression was changing as he processed the information in the folder. Look at this financial stuff. Look at the dates and amounts. Uncle Robert was getting payments from the Russian Naval Intelligence Service for almost 2 years. Those records could be forged, Dorothy Walsh insisted, but she was no longer shouting, and her absolute certainty was beginning to crack. By who? Agent Martinez asked, dropping her paramedic pretense and revealing her FBI credentials. By Admiral Chun? By the Navy? By multiple federal agencies working together to frame one relatively minor officer? Does that really seem more likely than the possibility that Captain Morrison was guilty of the crimes he was charged with? David Walsh was staring at his younger brother with growing alarm. Bobby, what are you saying? I'm saying maybe we made a mistake, Robert replied. Maybe Uncle Robert really was guilty, and maybe we just spent 3 days beating up an innocent woman because Mom convinced us that there was some kind of conspiracy. Michael Walsh's face was flushing with anger. So what? Even if Uncle Robert was guilty, that doesn't change what her father did to our family. Admiral Chun could have found a way to handle it quietly, but instead he made it public and humiliated us. He did his duty, General Williams said, emerging from the shadows at the edge of the warehouse complex. She was followed by General Harrison and General Torres, all three in full military dress uniforms that gleamed in the parking lot lights. The Walsh family spun around in shock, suddenly, realizing they were surrounded by far more authority than they had bargained for. Admiral James Chun was a man of absolute integrity, General Williams continued. When he discovered evidence of treason and corruption, he reported it through proper channels and testified truthfully under oath. That's not persecution. That's patriotism. General Harrison stepped forward, his imposing presence causing Michael Walsh to take an involuntary step backward. Your uncle's crimes could have resulted in the deaths of hundreds of American sailors. Admiral Chin's testimony probably saved more lives than you could count. And you repaid that service by attacking his daughter in a dark alley. We want justice, Dorothy Walsh said, but her voice was weak now, and she was clutching the court-martial records as if they were a life preserver. Then you'll get it, General Torres replied. Michael Walsh, David Walsh, you're under arrest for assault, conspiracy, and domestic terrorism. You have the right to remain silent. Federal agents emerged from concealment positions throughout the warehouse complex, surrounding the Walsh family with overwhelming force. But there was no violence, no dramatic confrontation. The three brothers submitted to arrest without resistance, as if the weight of the evidence against their uncle had drained all the fight out of them. Dorothy Walsh stood alone in the parking lot, still holding the folder of documents, tears streaming down her face as she finally confronted the truth about her brother's crimes. I spent 8 years believing he was innocent, she whispered. Sarah walked over to her, moving carefully because of her injuries, and spoke with compassion rather than anger. Mrs. Walsh, I understand why you needed to believe that, but the truth is that my father helped prevent a tragedy. Your brother's actions would have gotten people killed. Admiral Chun saved lives by doing his duty, even though he knew it would be difficult and painful for your family. What happens to me now? Dorothy Walsh asked. That depends on you, Agent Martinez said. You weren't directly involved in the assault, but you've been spreading false information and encouraging others to seek revenge against military families. You need to make a choice about what kind of person you want to be going forward." Sarah looked around at the assembled law enforcement and military personnel, at the three generals who had dropped everything to protect her, at the federal agents who had worked around the clock to track down her attackers. For the first time since her father's death, she felt completely connected to his legacy and completely proud of who he had been. "General Williams," she said, "I want to do something. I want to establish a foundation in my father's name to support the families of military personnel who are affected by court-martials and military justice proceedings. I want to help families understand the process and find counseling and support services." "That's an excellent idea," General Williams replied. "Admiral Chun would be very proud. And I want to move back to the naval base where I grew up. I want to stop running away from who I am." General Harrison smiled, the first genuine smile Sarah had seen from him since they met. "There's a library position open at the base school. The pay is better than what you were making in Millbrook." As the Walsh brothers were loaded into federal transport vehicles and Dorothy Walsh was led away for questioning, Sarah stood in the warehouse parking lot and watched the sunrise beginning to paint the eastern sky. She was tired, injured, and emotionally drained, but she was also something she hadn't been in 8 years, completely at peace with her father's legacy and her own identity. 3 months later, Sarah Chamorrison stood in the Admiral James Chun Memorial Library at Naval Station Norfolk, surrounded by books and students and the quiet satisfaction of work that honored both her father's memory and her own aspirations. The foundation she had established was already helping dozens of military families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges that came with military justice proceedings. The Walsh brothers have been sentenced to federal prison, terms ranging from 8 to 12 years. Dorothy Morrison Walsh had agreed to cooperate with investigators tracking down other conspiracy networks targeting military families, and she was now receiving counseling to help her process the truth about her brother's crimes. Most importantly, Sarah had learned that running away from her father's legacy had not been necessary. She could honor his memory while still living her own life, serve his values while still making her own choices. And whenever she needed a reminder of why that mattered, she had only to look at the framed photograph on her desk, a picture of Admiral James Chun in his dress uniform, surrounded by the officers he had mentored, including 3 young lieutenants who had grown up to become generals and had never forgotten their promise to protect his daughter. Some loyalties, Sarah had learned, really do last forever.